does it not make a difference?
Yeah, well, I was going to be doing the questions.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here with you and to see all of you in the room and to welcome those of you joining us online as well. My name is Peter Todd. I'm the Dean of the Imperial Business School, and I just wanted to come at the kickoff for this event and for the launch of the Destinations Net Zero paper, just to say welcome, first of all. It's great to have you with us today. I think through the event here and online, we'll have students obviously with us who are near to our heart and near to our mission at Imperial. We've got faculty colleagues here, we've got industry representatives, we've got government and policymakers, I think, who are joining us as well, and of course our friends from Hitachi who have been fundamental in allowing us to move this kind of research forward. I think it's sort of a great representation of what we try to do every day, I think, at Imperial. The President, Hugh Brady, often reminds us that if you look back to the charter of Imperial, it says, "We are here to be useful." And I think that's an important message that's part of the ethos of Imperial. I've been here just a little less than a year, and it's something I've definitely taken from the place, this idea that at Imperial we try to identify big problems out in the world, figure out how you pull the resources together to tackle those problems, and try to come up with useful solutions, recommendations, and approaches to solving those problems. And that idea of what is your best path, I think, kind of captures that idea that we're trying to move forward to create some kind of utility for the world. And to do that requires something else that I think is in the ethos of Imperial, and I think in the ethos of the way these kinds of projects are approached, which is it requires interdisciplinary teams. It requires people to come together from lots of different backgrounds in order to be able to tackle and solve these problems. You know, I won't know everyone who's been involved in this project, but I can imagine you have climate scientists. I know you have economists involved. You have environmental scientists. You have a whole variety of people. And you have the input from industry partners who are trying to understand these same issues from a very practical and pragmatic point of view. That's something we're trying to drive forward at Imperial, and you'll see and hear much more about this in the coming weeks as we launch our new schools of convergent science, which really are emblematic of Imperial's desire to pull together, harness the resources to tackle big problems. One of those, the Sustainability School, and the Sustainability School, I think, is one of the entities that will continue to drive this kind of important research at Imperial and to drive us forward. We do that almost always in partnership with people from out in the world, and so we're very grateful to, in this case, our colleagues from Hitachi for helping to move this project forward and help us, give us the capacity to be able to do this and interact in a meaningful way as we try to develop those kinds of solutions. I think that's also key to what we try to do. And I think it's particularly appropriate that you're talking today about paths to net zero and practical paths in a time in the world, frankly, where many people are walking back their commitments to net zero or not understanding how they can move forward on those commitments. It's something that I know Hitachi's committed to. I know it's something that we at Imperial are committed to. And I also know, and all of you probably know better than I, that no one's under the illusion that it's easy. And that's why it requires bringing together the riches of science and academia, along with industry, along with government, and frankly the rest of civil society, in order to be able to try to move these agendas forward. So I commend you for the work. I wish I could stay for the rest of the morning to learn all about it, but I'm going to take that with me, if that's okay, to have a look through. But I do want to listen in for a few minutes as you get started off, and wish you a great morning together. And again, to our friends from Hitachi, thank you very much for your help and support. And with that, I'm going to turn to Yuri to formally kick off the actual program. You want that? You're wired.
I think I'm wired. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Yuri Rogel. I'm a professor of climate science and policy, and I'm one of the academics involved in the Hitachi-Imperial Centre for Decarbonisation and Natural Climate Solutions. We're here today for the launch of a briefing paper that came out of the work of this center, and I want to start this maybe with providing a bit more broader context about the motivations and the drivers of why we were doing the research that we did, and why, and therefore the motivations behind this briefing paper. First and foremost, it is clear that by now the science is established around climate change. We understand the need for decarbonization. Every ton of CO2 that we continue to add to the atmosphere adds to global warming. Implications are simple. We need to stop carbon pollution to halt global warming. That in itself is an established fact, but still an enormous challenge. That challenge is enormous because of the deep uncertainty that is connected to how we go about dealing with this challenge. There is uncertainty about the strategies that we can pursue. Different portfolios of strategies have different implications. There is also deep uncertainty about the societal preferences around these strategies. It's not just about technical options we have, but it's also about societal desirability of these options. And finally, we also have an important challenge, and that is the interconnectedness about everything that we are looking at. Actions in one sector will affect what another sector needs to do or even can do. A good example here is a decarbonized transport system that focuses on electric vehicles only makes sense if we have a decarbonized power sector. But there are many more intricate interactions that we have to take into account between the land system, the agricultural system, the energy system, and carbon dioxide removal. Actions are not only connected between sectors, actions are also connected between regions. What one region decides to do, or strategies one region decides to pursue, will affect what another region can do. A good example of this is that not all renewable resources are equally distributed. Not all critical minerals are equally distributed, and those critical minerals are essential to develop renewable energy technologies. Also here, we see clear interactions and a clear interconnectedness that we need to understand. And finally, there is also an interconnectedness between addressing the climate challenge and addressing the many other challenges that we as a society actually try to deal with. These are jobs, quality of life, equity and justice, energy security. But equally, we have examples of, and examples that we have been worked on here within the Hitachi Centre on the interaction between climate action and biodiversity protection. So all these interactions make that this is a massively complex area, actually, of where we have to act to solve this climate challenge. And this is true for society as a whole, but also for a company as Hitachi, who actually finds itself on the interface between many of these challenges. So with that, that was one of the main motivations, or one of the main drivers, to set up the Hitachi-Imperial Centre for Decarbonisation and Natural Climate Solutions. The center in itself is built around three pillars: carbon management, climate repair and nature, and social system and transition. In the carbon management pillar, we take deep dives to understand the mitigation potential and the mitigation opportunities in individual sectors or individual industry. We also try to understand how we can actually follow the carbon and account for carbon production or emissions anywhere in our economy. If you then look at the second pillar, climate repair and nature, there we look at carbon dioxide removal, both the the technological means of doing this and more established natural means. The technological means, this is where we use chemical filters, for example, to capture CO2 from ambient air or from concentrated sources, after which we then can use it or store it in underground in geological formations. Many of this, or many of the measures that we consider to remove carbon dioxide, they also have interactions with these other sectors and other areas, as here we highlight biodiversity and nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions are solutions that use nature as the main driver or the main measure for achieving what we are trying to achieve, in this case, mostly carbon dioxide removal. But sometimes they can even conflict with nature itself, and that is a bit contradictory, but think about afforestation. Afforestation can be considered for carbon removal or for carbon uptake. However, if you put monocultures of forests, they really do not contribute to biodiversity. They can also negatively impact water availability or other sustainable development goals that we are trying to pursue. And then finally, we have the pillar of social system transitions. That's where we try to look more at the economic and policy research and also to have a more integrated view to bring everything together. We look at long-term pathways of integrated solutions linking to the different other research that is going on in the different pillars. How did this look like for the past, for the time leading up to this briefing? The Hitachi-Imperial Centre is a 5-year initiative. So we try to tackle these key challenges that I just laid out. We work through research projects. We have, under each of the pillars, there are several research projects that have now concluded and others that are ongoing. And importantly, we also, as a center, we also train the next generation of net zero scientists and engineers. And that is both through providing opportunities for postdocs to do challenging research in this area, but also the center also provides PhD studentships to really train the next generation of scientists. At Imperial, Imperial is a very big banner, but as I pointed out and I was highlighted in the introduction, this is a very interdisciplinary endeavor. Several faculties are involved: the Faculty of Natural Science, the Faculty of Engineering, the Business School. Also at Hitachi, we collaborate with Hitachi Europe, with the European R&D Center and Hitachi, and then the main office. And with that, I think I've provided enough context to hand over to Nadine, who was the lead on this briefing paper that we are presenting today, Destination Net Zero, What's Your Best Path?
I have to say, Yori did most of my job already. But hi, everyone. I'm Nadine. I'm a researcher at Imperial. And today, I'll be giving you some of the insights from the Hitachi-Imperial Centre for Decarbonisation and Natural Solutions. So essentially, I'll first start with why this matters, why is it timely, why are we talking about this right now, what we set out to do, and then I'll show you some of our research and insights, and I'll conclude with some key takeaways and our future work. So why is this important? What makes this net zero paper different from a lot of the papers out there? One is that we don't look at one single pathway to net zero, because there is no single pathway to net zero. We highlight that there are multiple pathways to net zero, each with their own trade-offs. And so that means that decisions on technology, policy, and investments need to be flexible and responsive to new information as we go along, to evolving risks and opportunities. It's also quite important to note that a lot of the pathways that we look into are done with a top-to-bottom approach. And so once we've done that, we need to start looking at it from a bottom-to-top approach. We need to start integrating granularity into this. We need to look into and propose net zero strategies that are regional and sector-specific. And most importantly, and something that Yori already touched upon, is that we need to look at it from an integrated lens. We need to look at things not just from a technical perspective, so not just looking at the emission reduction technologies and the carbon removal technologies, but also looking at biodiversity and how are we going to account for all of this, whether it's from a carbon perspective or a nature perspective. None of those should be and can be treated in isolation. So how did we do that? We first, as I mentioned, we assessed the multiple scenario pathways, which we'll talk about. And then we understand the different trade-offs that exist across the sectors and solutions. We then provide an integrated lens on carbon accounting, biodiversity, and policy design in the aim of delivering tangible insights for policymakers and industry stakeholders. So what do those pathways look like? In the paper, we look at 4 contrasting pathways. And by contrasting, I mean they're quite different in a lot of different ways. So they're different in terms of the technology mix that they use, the removal strategy that they have, and the energy demand. They also score quite differently when it comes to their cost, their environmental impact, the resources that they use, and they score differently when it comes to how fair, robust, or resilient they are. They're also quite different in terms of how innovative they are. So what kind of technologies do they use? Do they maintain what we know now, legacy infrastructure, or do they implement innovative technologies? They also differ in terms of the pace as to how they reach net zero. So, for example, scenario A, we've named it conservative continuity because it's slow and incremental nature to reaching net zero. Whereas B is the innovative balance, where we input a lot of innovative technologies, such as direct air capture. Scenario C was named accelerated decarbonization, so that one was quite fast. There was an aggressive shift to renewables, rapid phasing out of fossil fuels. And scenario D was named slow transition. So we do reach net zero, but the progress is quite slow. And there are 2 main insights that I'd like to point out when it comes to those scenarios. One is that actually for all of the different pathways, we have carbon removal. So no matter what pathway you take to net zero, you will always have residual emissions that you need to remove using carbon removal technologies, which we'll talk about in a bit. And the other thing is that energy demand is a key driver as to how we shape those scenarios. So it's a key driver in terms of infrastructure needs, the residual emissions that we get in the end and how much we need to remove, and also the land use pressure, which obviously affects biodiversity. And so we used transport as a case study. We wanted to look at the net zero strategy from a bit more granular perspective. We wanted to look at a specific industry, and we looked at transport. Because, I mean, it's quite a big industry that we need to decarbonize, whether it's in terms of the transport itself, but all the energy it requires. And so, for instance, it's responsible for 12 to 15% of the primary energy demand across all of the different scenarios. So no matter which scenario you look at, it's responsible for around 12 to 15% of the whole primary energy demand across the scenario. And when you look at transport, as I mentioned, it's a big sector. There's also subsectors within transport. So you can look at aviation, you can look at maritime, you can look at heavy good vehicles. And across the transportation industry, there are different solutions to decarbonizing it. So you can electrify some of the technologies, so use electrification. You can also use hydrogen as a fuel, or you could use biofuels, for instance, or synthetic fuels. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on those radar charts because you can read more about it in the report. But what I wanted to highlight here is that all of the different solutions within the different subsectors are rated across various dimensions, such as how much resources do they need, or how much energy do they need, and how scalable they are. And as you can see, none of the different solutions rate or get the best scores across all of the different dimensions, because essentially, there's no one-size-fits-all in transport decarbonization, whether it's in terms of the whole transportation industry or within the different subsectors. So even if we do all of this, we're still left with residual emissions. And so how does carbon removal work out? So as I mentioned, across all the different scenarios, so scenarios A to D from left to right, you're left with residual emissions, and so you need to do carbon removal. And note that those scenarios are based from the sixth assessment report that was released by the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And in that report, a lot of the different technologies for carbon dioxide removal came out in the past years, and so they were underrepresented in that sixth report. But they'll show up a lot more in the seventh report, hopefully. But anyway, even with the underrepresentation of the different technologies, you see that there's a portfolio of different technologies that you can use. But in our paper, then we expand this portfolio. We develop a framework to evaluate all of the different carbon removal pathways that exist. And again, I'm not going to go through the individual radar charts or the individual technologies because you can find a lot more information on the paper. But it's important to note that although we've done this framework to compare the different options or the different carbon dioxide removal options across various dimensions that are technical or environmental or monitoring, again, you see that there is no silver bullet. There is no one technology that rates best across all of the different dimensions. And so we kind of end the argument of nature and engineering-based solutions, whether you should use one or the other, by having this key conclusion where we say that nature and engineering-based solutions are complementary. They each have their distinct role when it comes to our net zero strategies. Having said that, we've looked at emission reduction technologies, and we've looked at the carbon removal pathways and technologies. We cannot do that, again, without thinking about how we affect our ecosystem. And so this was another part of our research where you can see the figure on the right shows you the responsive ecosystem function to increasing biodiversity. And so it's really important that when we consider our net zero strategies, when we start implementing our different technologies, especially ones that are land intensive, so for instance, renewable energy or biomass-based carbon removal technologies, we really need to think about how that affects our ecosystem and what kind of effects will we have on biodiversity. And so when we think about diverse ecosystems, we cannot think about them as just co-benefits, which is usually how we think about it right now. They're also climate resilience enablers, and that's super crucial to consider. Another climate enabler that we need to consider once we do our net zero strategies or when we do our net zero strategies is how we're going to account for the carbon that we're emitting. How are we going to make sure that we're actually reaching our net zero strategies when we're doing those timely carbon reports. And so you can see on the right here, there's a table that's showing all the different carbon accounting methods, such as spend-based, hybrid, supply-specific. Again, I'm not going to go through the specifics of the different carbon accounting methods, but they're rated here using a traffic light system across various dimensions. Dimensions such as how much data do they need, do you have to rely on third party to get some of that data? And again, you can see that none of them score green across all dimensions. So there isn't a single carbon accounting method that you can just kind of say, this is the one, we should use it for all sectors across all of the net zero strategies that we want to implement. And that makes it a bit complicated because carbon accounting, I mean, it can be easy, but it can also be complex, especially when you're looking at indirect emissions, specifically your scope 3 emissions, so your indirect emissions across your supply chain. But it's quite important to try and make sure that you get it right, because whichever carbon accounting method we use, and no matter what number we get, we might be underrepresenting it, underrepresenting our emissions. And if we underrepresent our emissions, obviously the carbon removal that we need to do will just increase. So the wedge for carbon removal will just go from relatively big to bigger. And so the priority must not be that we find this one carbon accounting method that we're going to be using across everything, but instead be extremely transparent about how we're doing our carbon accounting, have carbon accounting methods that are robust within our sector or region. So what does this all mean? So core takeaways that I want you to go out with. One, there is no single pathway to net zero. We need to implement flexible portfolios, whether it's from an emission reduction technologies perspective or a carbon removal perspective. We're always going to need flexible portfolios that are responsive to changes. We need to do mitigation and removal together, not sequentially. We cannot assume that in 2045, when we need a lot of carbon removal, that all of the infrastructure will just magically exist. We need to start doing it from now. Carbon accounting is not a side job. It's not something that we're just doing to kind of publish a report on a yearly basis. It's super foundational when it comes to climate finance and climate risk in terms of underrepresenting our emissions and maybe not getting our net zero targets. And last but not least, not siloing biodiversity. So thinking about biodiversity quite early on, thinking about the effect of the technologies that we're going to be implementing to avoid unintended trade-offs. And so all in all, coordinated action is needed. Coordinated action is needed when it comes to aligning mitigation, removal, biodiversity, and our socioeconomic goals. And to do that, we need to stop thinking about net zero as just a technological problem, as much as I would like to do that as an engineer, but we can't. We need to think about it as a systems transformation challenge. And so our research wants to strengthen those systems that underpin decarbonization by looking at energy systems, infrastructure, demand-side behavior, and global supply chains. And the goal of that would be to bridge the system-level insights with implementation strategies. And with that, I'd like to thank you so much for listening. I'll also lead you to the paper. So this is the QR code that can lead you to the paper, and open for any questions, whether it's for me or my co-authors. Thank you so much. Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
I'll wait for mine.
Sorry.
Thank you, Nadine. Would you mind just turning back to your Making Net Zero Real slide? That one. I'm really impressed by the report. I think it's a fantastic body of work, and I can really see how this is going to be of use to Hitachi and other kind of multinationals in a similar way. I wondered, thinking beyond that, what levers do you think need to be applied to different decision makers in order to get these things to happen?
Yeah, so when it comes to, I think there's different levers depending on what you're looking into. So for instance, when it comes to the flexible portfolios, we're going to need a portfolio of different technologies. One of the most important things, and something that comes up again and again, is that we need long-term business models. We need to know that once you invest in a certain technology, it's relatively long-term because some of that infrastructure will last for more than 20 years or 25 years. And so as an investor, you want to minimize that risk. And to minimize that risk, you're going to need those long-term business models with long-term policy signals. The other thing, for instance, when it comes to biodiversity, for example, you're going to really need to rely here on policy kind of making sure that this is something that we consider quite early on. So it's not something that's an add-on or something that we consider as a co-benefit, but instead something that we consider really early on alongside everything we're already doing. So not just looking at the technologies, but their impact on the ecosystem. Because if we don't do that early on, we can have unintended trade-offs that we'll find out later at a later stage. And at that point, it might be too late to fix that. So I'd say there's quite different levers depending on what you look at. It always kind of goes back to policies a bit. But I would say one of the two main things that I would say on this slide is one, long-term business models, and considering biodiversity quite early on from a policy perspective when it comes to doing the regional or national net zero strategies, which will water down as you go to sector-specific net zero strategies.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
Just to add to those thoughts, I think an additional lever is that the stakeholders in companies, through the information, for example, this work, but all the other work, by bringing forward the risks that are inherent and the solutions that need to be taken into account, be it consumers or shareholders or investors, pension funds, etc. The knowledge and the information can drive the right investment or the right decision-making or processes. So I think, you know, policy is clearly one, but failing strong policies, having many incentives and information from the other stakeholders is also an important lever.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Firstly, thank you so much. It was a really good presentation and it's clearly an excellent paper. I wanted to ask about social equality. We commonly think about the unequal impact of both climate change and the transition to net zero as an effect, but we don't necessarily think about socioeconomic inequality as a cause and potential driver of, to an extent, some of the consumer behavior that can drive a lot of the problems that we're seeing at the moment. How do you, and to an extent, how does your team see the role of enhancing socioeconomic equality as part of the solution and as part of a net zero transition pathway, rather than a potential negative impact to be mitigated?
I'd say very much so. It's definitely something that we look into. So you can see in the first slide, we rate the different, and I mean, Hamish can talk more about this because that was part of his research, but we rate the different scenarios based on their fairness. It's super important that you look at the different socioeconomic impacts of how you do things. And that's why I mentioned we shouldn't just be looking at the technology perspective, not even just the biodiversity or the accounting perspective in the last slide, but also the socioeconomic goals. What do you want to reach? So for instance, in the UK, there's this leveled up framework that we want to follow, where we bring up all the different regions together as we reach net zero. And usually the way that works is that there's spillover effects. And you basically want to aim that those spillover effects are obviously positive. So as you invest in a certain region or a certain place or a certain technology, you want that technology or investment basically to have spillover effects across the economy in a way where you're increasing or maximizing socioeconomic impact. So it's definitely something that you need to consider when it comes to your net zero strategy, and it's something that we've talked about in our research as well. And maybe there are more people that want to add questions to that.
Yeah, mine is about your point around flexibility. So flexibility is obviously good, but the danger with flexibility is it can cause paralysis. So people don't know what to do. So I was curious on your opinion of what do you see as being some of the very low regret near-term actions that people can take that don't, let's say, rule out being flexible in the future?
I want to point out that when I say flexible, I think it's more that it's not just that we invest in all of the different technologies, but instead that when we're investing in different technologies, we account for the fact that, let's say we're investing in a certain asset for a certain technology, let's say carbon capture, for example, and all of the remaining assets around it or the infrastructure around it, can we repurpose that in the long run if we need to? So if at some point we don't have, I mean, we probably won't, but let's say suddenly we don't have any more carbon emissions. Can we repurpose the transport pipelines, for example, to something else? And so that's more of what we mean when it comes to flexible portfolios, thinking about how can we do asset management, essentially. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I just realized, low-hanging fruit. So in our scenarios, sorry, I'll get to your question in a second. So in our scenarios, there were things that were across all of the different scenarios. One of them, for example, was renewable energy. That was quite obvious. It was across all of the different scenarios. Carbon capture came up in a lot of the different scenarios as well. And carbon removal was something that we 100% need, no matter what pathway we take. So those, I would say, are the low-hanging fruit that we absolutely need to be investing in. Sorry, back to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just really interested in understanding a little bit better how you've come up with the scenarios and the scoring that you've attached to each of those. And I think, you know, some of the things that kind of striking me are the accelerated decarbonisation scenario doesn't look so good from an economic perspective, whereas the slow transition scenario, I would maybe expect the environmental score to be lower. So I'd just be interested to understand a little bit better how those scores have been developed, your level of confidence in how you've estimated those. Thanks.
Yep. I'll just start by saying that we wanted to look at completely contrasting pathways, and from there I'll pass on to Hamish.
So I won't go into too much detail in terms of the kind of all of the different indicators. You can go to the paper and you can see kind of how we construct each of these dimensions. But essentially we take scenarios that sit within the AR6 database that reach 1.5 degrees, and we run a quantitative framework over those scenarios, and we have a process of selecting kind of the most diverse set. And so that's the result that you're seeing here, and all we're trying to do is present essentially a range of different futures that come to the same goal. On your point around the environmental score, so when we're thinking about environmental sustainability in this context, we've got two indicators. One is to do with the use of BECCS, another one is to do with deforestation under that dimension. So the accelerated decarbonisation scenario that has much higher demand, and I believe has high levels of CDR, and that would probably contribute to the higher score on the environmental dimension. But if you're interested, as of today, I have a link to the paper, so I can share that, and you can read more about the dimensions and the indicators.
Thanks. Any more questions? Yeah. And just note that all of my brilliant co-authors are here, so any question can be passed on.
Thank you. I want to ask, while these discussions are happening in the academic circles and the policymakers, how do we make sure that this information reaches to the general public who, our skepticism is growing about climate change and the result of it. So how do we make sure these things can reach to the general public and they can make a decision about it?
Yeah. I have to say this is a question that I didn't think of as of maybe a year or 2 years ago. As an engineer, I was focused on building those technologies, making sure they work. But it's quite important to make sure that such research reaches the general public, not just industry and policymakers, but also the general public, because inevitably they will influence policy and policymakers, right? And so we do things like this, where we are writing a paper that's not a journal article, so it's not purely for academics, but something that's called a briefing paper or a white paper that's available to the general public. Also in research, there's a lot of work going on in terms of making sure that journal articles are open access, so you can access the paper even though it's a scientific and it's in a scientific journal. As a general public, you can access it if you'd like to. And so it's quite important to make sure that we communicate those things outside of scientists and academia, and even just industry and policymakers to the general public with events such as this, with papers such as this, and by collaborating with industry as well, which is what we're trying to do here.
How many people do actually read these papers? Even I came to know about these topics because I was I'm a student here, and I got an email about it, and that's why I came here.
Yeah.
How many people actually try to learn about this stuff on their own, and how do you make sure that?
Yeah. I'd say quite a lot. One, because of, again, this is just my opinion and what I've noticed, but for instance, if you look at the Energy Futures podcast, you get around thousands of views on that. You have around 11,000 subscribers on that. So there are people out there that are listening to this. And all of the language that we use in such podcasts or such papers are accessible to the general public. So we don't use scientific or too scientific terms or get into a lot of detail into how we do the research. That's one. The other thing is that I've noticed, at least from my cousins, for example, or kids I know these days, is that a lot of this work goes into the education system now. So, for example, I mean, this literally just happened last week. I was studying geography with a friend, with my niece, and I was like, okay, this is so out of my scope. I don't know anything about geography. But actually, when I looked at it, it was basically mostly climate change. And I was like, oh, okay, no, I can teach you this, come on. And so there is a lot of things changing when it comes to the general public, and you can see that even within the education system. It was not something that I was taught, for example, or maybe it was like a one-liner somewhere. Yeah, last question. I was just about to check the time.
So I'll be going into asset management, and I just wanted to know if you could elaborate a bit more about the work that you're doing with like the finance people and how that like concretely looks like. How is that embedded today into like corporate practices?
Sorry, so is your question, how are we embedding our financial decisions? Sorry, how
does this paper apply to practicals in the financial space? Like you've talked about, for example, like having flexible portfolios. Like I don't know, I'm just like want to get to know more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I can refer back to Mirabel's point where she was talking about the more we know, the more we can make sound decisions when it comes to investment. And this is what we're trying to show here, that there are different pathways to net zero. There's a lot of different technologies. There are commonalities. So there are technologies, as we mentioned, that are low-hanging fruit that we need to kind of invest in no matter what. We will always need renewable energy. We will always need carbon removal. We will also always need certain technologies to remove carbon dioxide or generate power when renewable energy is just because it's intermittent. And so that's what we're aiming with. That's what we're aiming for with this paper.
And just a follow-up question on that: how do you reconcile? You've mentioned we have to have like a long-term view in these pathways, or like long-term. How do you reconcile that with like asset managers that have a very like short-term view of like where they're managing stocks and stuff like that? It's like very extremely short-term. So how do we make that work?
Sorry, what's your example of short-term?
I'm just thinking about like for example, managing a portfolio. You're looking at like 2-3 months into the future sometimes, like not always extremely long-term. And so I'm wondering, how do you apply scenarios like these that are like looking 50, 100 years into the future? I don't know what's the is that different time frames? I don't know if I'm making sense.
Yes, so essentially, whilst we're looking at scenarios that go all the way to 2100, they're incremental, so you can see what you're supposed to be doing by 2030, by 2026, by 2027. And so essentially, even though they're long-term scenarios, you do have this incremental view of what's going on in between. That's one. The other thing is that I mentioned quite early on in the presentation that those scenarios are very much top to bottom. So it's like, okay, we're going to reach net zero. This is how we're reaching net zero. And the next part of this is that we need to do this bottom-to-top approach. And when we're doing those bottom-to-top approaches, we would then look into more detail into the short-term things that you mentioned, for example. We would also look into more detail as to which technologies work in which specific region, and which technologies can work because of the different resources that exist, depending on where you're at. So renewable energy, for example, let's say doing renewable energy to up to 80% might not be feasible for a lot of different countries. So it really, really depends on where you're at. So the bottom-to-top approach is where we would answer your question.
To complement that a little bit, from an investment perspective, the technologies that we show here, they're not cheap, and it's not something you can expect to have a return in 3 months, let alone 1-2 years. So these are investments that should be made thinking of long term, and it should be complemented with some clear and certain policy measures to hedge the risk.
Yeah. Which goes back to my point about long-term business models.
Hi.
Last question. Last question.
Okay, just to bring it all together, how do you account for the volatile nature of the political climate we're going through at the moment? Because in a stable world where we're all making long-term decisions on what's the best for everybody in the next 100 years, this is an incredible tool. How do we make it work when we are living in very unexpected times, if I may say?
Yeah. I don't know if I have the answer to that. I don't know if anyone wants to chip in here, but it's still really important to look at the long-term scenarios. And I think I'll pass on to Yuri, actually, since he has an answer.
These scenarios are to explore implications of what-if scenarios for the future. They don't tell us the future. So even merely between those 4 pathways where we decarbonize, there are huge differences in choices, let alone between those pathways and the pathways where we don't decarbonize, or where one part of the world decarbonizes and another doesn't. But that's a layer on top. So what we are describing here as well is not prescriptive. We just provide a tool for in this case, in collaboration with Hitachi, to think about this complexity, to be able to grapple with this and then make informed decisions. One won't be able to make decisions that are robust against any possible future, but with appropriate tools, one can make decisions that are robust to as many futures as possible. So.
I wouldn't have answered that well, so I'm glad you were here. I think we said last question, sorry. If anyone has any more questions, feel free to email us, or we're here around after. And with that, I'll pass on to the panel discussion.
So, good morning, everyone. My name is Mirabel Mules. I'm an associate professor of economics in the business school, and I'm co-director of the Hitachi-Imperial Centre with Professor Mary Ryan. And I'm co-director of the new School of Sustainability. So I'll be chairing this panel today. And before we start, I'll let each of us introduce themselves. Agnieszka.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me, yes. So Agnieszka Skorupińska, I work for Hitachi Brussels office. I am a government affairs specialist active in sustainability policies. So what we do in Brussels is to monitor the geopolitical sustainability trends. That's how we call it now, because sustainability is very political. Much more than when I started my career. And then, of course, we are following all the legislative developments, so all the laws that are being produced by the Brussels machine in the field of decarbonization, circular economy, and biodiversity. Very happy to be here.
Yuri?
Yeah, I already introduced myself shortly. So I'm a professor in climate science and policy. My main research is on long-term transformation pathways. I work on understanding how what we know about our planet impacts the policy decisions that we need to make, carbon budgets, both from a technical point of view, but also from an equity and justice point of view.
Hi everyone, I'm Francis Robson. I'm the carbon neutrality specialist for Hitachi Energy. I work in a global sustainability team across the whole company, basically setting standards and guidance on how we account for our greenhouse gas emissions, and off the back of that, assisting with setting the strategies on how we deal with it.
Hi everyone, I'm Nilesh Shah. I'm an engineer from Imperial College, another co-director of the new School of Sustainability, and I'm interested in systems methods for decarbonisation.
Thank you. So thank you everyone, all of you, for joining us today. We thought that, building on the briefing paper and the great presentation by Nadine, we bring together different perspectives on this question of destination net zero. Agnieszka, do you want to start with your thoughts on, what does it mean for you in your position and in your discussions with policy?
Absolutely. So maybe a few words about the Brussels mood before I make some comments about the study. We are living in times where there is a lot of denialists and a lot of climate bashing, and the feeling we have when reading media and press is that we are walking back, especially one part of the world. But also in Brussels, there is a lot of noise now. You probably hear that there is this whole exercise of simplification of the regulation, and very often media simplify it and say it's the regulation. We have a different perspective on this. What we are seeing in Brussels is to review not the what, but the how. So the overall objectives are still here. We are aiming at 2050 net zero. As we speak, European Commission is working on another intermediate target on how to get there. So as you know, we have 2030 target of 55% of emission reduction. And now the Commission is working on the 2040 target of 90% of reduction, so that we do not wake up in 2049 and like, whoa, we are not there. So things are continuing. We are not lacking the ambition, but as I said, some things are changing, and notably the way how to get there. And the Commission is trying to help companies and raise more awareness and get more buy-in from the society, because what we saw this last years was that a lot has happened, too much has happened at a very fast pace without really explaining the details, and there's a little bit of reservations from citizens and businesses on how to join this journey. So realization and also rewriting the narrative a little bit. So we are not only talking about the climate here, but we are now talking about economic security. Because it's not like we can decide, okay, let's give up on climate. We are in Europe in a very difficult situation from energy perspective and from resources perspective. So only clean transition can actually make us alive, because we don't have fossil fuels and we don't have resources. So you have to go into renewables and you have to go into circular economy. The mathematics is quite clear. So that's why I think this will continue, and this is that's the message we are communicating internally, and we still have a strong buy-in from our executives to continue this journey and to be a global company for climate transformation. And just to finish on what we heard from the study, two important things that we also hear a lot in Brussels is to look at this issue end-to-end and from big picture perspective. You cannot only work in your office on this little topic of decarbonization. There's a lot of things around that you also have to take into account, and someone needs to decide, and we have to do some trade-offs, and everyone needs to communicate, everyone needs to sit down together and come up with solutions. So very, very valuable. And then one more thing, sorry, I'm a little bit too long. I just want to say that we are living in the times of fear as well. There's a lot of alternative facts, a lot of disinformation, so we really need this kind of research and this kind of solid methodologies, and we have to really be noisy as the other side is, to promote those data, because otherwise the fear will win.
Thank you for these nearly optimistic thoughts. Nile, thinking of trade-offs, I think this is a recurring theme that we need to make trade-offs between sectors, between the different elements that we optimize in scenarios. Do you think, can you, in addition to your thoughts on the paper or generally, what are the tools or the data or the information we need to support the decision-making around these trade-offs?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and I think being transparent about what we know and what we don't know, and actually calling out disinformation where it's blatant, I think is really important. But then I think we should also reflect on the fact that the economic and industrial system we've been dealing with over the last few years or even over the last 20 years has always been quite robust to a lot of weird volatilities, right? So crude oil, I remember when I was, an undergrad, it fell to $15 a barrel because there was a so-called netback pricing issue in the Middle East, and it's been as high as 150. So it has a 10-to-1 volatility, and economic systems adapt. And natural gas, has been varying from, let's say, 30 euros a megawatt hour to probably 300 to 400 euros a megawatt hour in the last few years, and the systems evolve. And actually, interestingly, what we would expect to see in all of the scenarios we've described there is a financing challenge, because these transitions they're capital investment heavy, but then you live in a world with much lower volatility, much more predictability, less climate volatility, less economic dependence on geographic regions that may be challenging, and less uncertainty around materials, especially going to material circularity. So there are a lot of positive aspects that are not necessarily climate related, but they are getting rid of a lot of the uncertainties that we deal with. So I see it as mainly this transition, I see it mainly as a financing challenge, because it does require a lot of capex, but the kinds of solutions we're talking about, they're actually OPEX light, and it's the OPEX that creates a lot of the volatility. So I think putting across these messages and, for example, explaining to people that energy price volatility in the last few years is absolutely nothing to do with decarbonisation. And politicians who actually say that are being irresponsible, either deliberately or they're ignorant, I don't know which. And it's probably our responsibility to explain that a lot of these things that are being discussed now, they're to do with our current system and its failings. And actually, whichever scenario we follow in that one, if we do it with good evidence, with good data and good practices, actually our economic and industrial and societal systems will actually be more robust rather than less.
Thank you, Nile. Francis, in navigating those data and information in your role, what are the challenges that you see from a corporate perspective, and how to tackle that uncertainty?
Getting the data is the challenge. So it's kind of, it feels like it's trickling down slowly but surely. And a lot of the stuff that we do these days in our strategy or our targets that we set is partially driven by our customers, the next tier up, if you like, asking, say, we want you to set targets or do these activities, otherwise we're not going to buy from you. So there's a lot of drive there, and we're in turn doing the same to our tier one suppliers, and slowly but surely it trickled down through the chain. And when we speak to our supply chain, ask them for that data, because that's where we want it from. We don't want to rely on secondary data or average emission factors and things like that. We want to get it from the horse's mouth and find out how many emissions is actually generated when you create the steel that we use. We want to know that from you. So we've got to do a lot of engagement work with them, training them to understand the topic and why it's important, why we care, why they should care. But then actually performing the measurements and getting the data is a task in itself, and they've got to do by themselves, put in the monitoring systems or hire more people to take care of that stuff, and actually people who care about that, and it's their focus. It's not just another hat on another person who's not really trained in it, doesn't know what they're doing. It's its own entity, it's its own topic, and it needs dedication. So it's, like I said, more of a question of motivation, really, from the people that we need to get the data for, is motivating them to say, we need that data, we want it, it's important to us, it should be important to you, here's all the reasons why. And it's a slow, ongoing process. We are making progress, but yeah, it won't stop anytime soon.
Thank you, Francis. Yuri, you build on these scenarios, some pathways to action. Where do you find between the data and knowing what the problem is, which, you know, as scientists, we can be very aware, and the fear can come up. And, you know, setting the right direction, where do you feel that this how can science or research help with that?
I think there are a few ways in which research or academics can help there. On the one hand, there is a key need to translate kind of the very broad scale and broad brush futures that these scenarios describe to actual policy decisions or actual decisions in companies. What does it mean at the sector level? What does it mean at the plant level? What does it mean at the infrastructure level? Or indeed, what does it mean at the policy level? In many of these models that we are looking at and in these scenarios, policies are very vaguely described. It's a general carbon tax, and then things get pushed, and well, it's not that. We have lots of evidence. You have lots of evidence as well in your research. That's not the end all or the ideal solution in all cases. So I think there, academics can help in making their insights more directly linked to the decisions and the work that decision makers have to make. In that sense, I think it's also important not to just do the research, but to step outside of the research bubble. One example of this is in advisory committees, advisory boards, advising companies, advising countries in climate science committees, and so on, to really make this link. Not to rely on others, to have to try and understand what academics meant when they were saying something, but do the effort yourself to bring it and make it relevant.
Yeah, thank you, Yuri. Agnieszka, this comes back to you then. So you are at this intersection of policy and corporate. So two questions maybe for you is, one, the information that comes out of research or from your experience or from the data collection can inform policy making, but that policy making is often, you know, having to redirect, and in particular, the current trade and trade tensions are, you know, at everyone's front of mind, and what they mean for the transition. So do you feel there are places where more information is needed, or is it more about re-explaining things or looking at things with a new angle?
I think it's more a question of silos, because we still work in silos. Like, you have your research bubble, we have our Brussels bubble. Companies also have their bubble, so we have to get all these bubbles together and refocus on what data is really needed, because this is exactly what is happening now with CSRD, and so corporate responsible reporting and due diligence reporting, that there are just too many data points, and not all of them make change. So we have to really refocus, have a board, put all the data on, and discuss together with different angles what matters and what leads to a real change. So refocusing, one thing. And then second thing, yes, looking for good practices, because we already have some systems that work, like ETS emission system, for instance, is working very well. We can see that it is impacting European Union emissions reduction, and companies manage to play the game. There is one methodology, data is comparable, and so on and so forth. So let's learn from things that already exist. And then third, yes, the global aspect is very tricky, because especially for global companies, it's really not easy to make up your mind and to have a global strategy now, where you can be sanctioned in one country, one region for not being compliant, and sanctioned in another country for being compliant in this other region, which is just like impossible situation for companies. So there is a lot of, that's what we also do in Brussels. When speaking with decision makers, we really make this point that we cannot get the data that is not available from, for instance, when you look at China, China is going very far in blocking the access to data. So we are then in an impossible situation, and it's the role of the institutions to engage with those regions, to have a dialogue, and to come up with something that is sensible. So this international cooperation, despite all the wins now, still need to continue, and we really call the institutions to help us in getting this meaningful data and not giving up.
That's really interesting to think about these global perspectives. In addition, so Francis, you talked also about data. So, you know, I'm a data geek. I love collecting data and looking at it. But once we have the data, you know, when describing intentions to decarbonize, the first reflex is often say, okay, we need the data to know where we are and where we want to go. But where do you feel what are the biggest barriers from moving from intent and data collection to actual investment and action?
Well, many people might feel that way, that they need data first to know where they are and what to do. To be honest, I don't completely buy into that. I try to tell people not to worry too much about that. Like, we don't really have much time, so start doing things now. We'll get the data as we go, but it doesn't mean just wait for it. We haven't got time to wait, so get on with doing something, anything. Like the paper talks about this. There's common things that we can start doing now that we know will have a good effect across all those scenarios. We don't have to wait. So I think that can be sort of a paralysis you mentioned about waiting for data and waiting for things to tell you what to do. Everyone instinctively knows what they need to do, what they should do, what they could do. Get on and do it. It doesn't matter if you don't have the data to be able to tell people, look what I've done. It's kind of a selfish kind of point of view, perhaps. So I think once we do have the data, it gives us greater focus of what kind of strategies we can set and what activities we can do. And in certain parts of our company, we have data-rich environments in our own sites and the amount of energy we use and things like that. So it's really easy to focus on and say, let's manage energy better here, let's reduce the losses of these gases over here. Let's buy renewable electricity as much as we can, wherever we can, and those all work really well. It's kind of low-hanging fruit. It's the scope 3 side, the indirect side. It's much harder to get that data. But again, I try to tell people and explain, let's not wait. We can still do things now. I guess the problem with that is, I talked about it before, the motivation. Why? Why would I do it if there's no advantage, no benefit? Say if a customer isn't asking for it, or if it doesn't put us ahead of a competitor, or there's no regulation forcing me to do it, why should I do it? We know the moral reasons for trying to battle climate change, but when it gets to a company level and the kind of thinking, business strategy level, a lot of the time it boils down to money, and it talks about the problems with finance. I think that's the problem we've got to solve. We've got to make it worthwhile to do the right thing. If all the other indicators aren't there, at least doing the right thing should have some benefit, none at all.
I can add, sorry, but there's a big realization on that point in Brussels now. And for instance, next year there will be a big review of the Public Procurement Directive. And as you know, public procurement is a big creation of demand for certain services and products, and they are now reflecting to add non-price criteria to those bids. So you will have to prove your decarbonization, circularity, cybersecurity, data protection compliance before you can participate in bids. So there is work ongoing on how to reward this kind of approach and practical use of data, so that companies do not get discouraged and they see the purpose and they see the business purpose above all.
I'll add something as well. I still think a lot of investing is vibe-based, and really the best example of that is AI, right? So if you look at the amount of money that goes into AI compared to decarbonisation, with really patchy ROI data at the moment, right? It's mainly based on some kind of vibe. It just shows you that if one can change the narrative around decarbonisation, it's not as though the money isn't there. And actually, coupling the two, you know, if you take places like Republic of Ireland, maybe US, and other parts of the world, it would be an obvious thing to do to say, look, anybody who wants to invest in new data centers or compute centers, as I call them, you've got to make them net zero from the start, and you've got to back integrate your supply chain and make that net zero as part of your investment. So make that a catalyst for driving decarbonisation, for example, rather than just leaving it as something discrete and separate from the energy and infrastructure system.
Yeah, I agree. I think the digital infrastructure and decarbonization will probably, you know, be growing in importance in how we embed both early on. So I think, you know, we've touched on the finance aspect. I'm keen we go back to the question of social acceptance and the fear and the pushback you were talking about. And Yuri, in Nadine's presentation, the question of socio-economic aspects came up. What are your thoughts on how we can, you know, point society and public opinion and the narrative to what's in it and to bring them along?
Yeah, it's a big question. It's a difficult question. Interestingly, actually, I recently saw a talk by a neuroscientist talking about how the connection between beliefs, preferences, and actions. And actually what neuroscience, and we often think we need to change the narrative, we need to make sure the beliefs are there and then the actions will follow. And what actually neuroscience research shows, it's the other way around. Our actions determine our beliefs. So having good examples of things that have worked are much more powerful than having just stories without actions. So in that sense, I would say start doing things, start implementing measures that are beneficial for communities, that increase their resilience, that increase their quality of life, that increase their access to services that they desire, while being carbon neutral, or at least on a clearly decarbonizing path. I think that is the important focus that needs to be taken. In a way, definitely in the academic community and also in some activist community, there is a lot of talk about kind of revolutionary or radical change. Unfortunately, how contradictory it might sound, I don't think we have time for radical change, because even the most radical change takes like 2-3 decades to kind of settle down. By that, we have to work with the system and nudge this system that we have into the best future we can provide.
Yeah, thank you. Nile, you've worked with companies and in particular on Scope 3 work. So as for the public and all of us having good examples of what works, can you tell us a story of things that have worked for companies?
Yeah. In fact, you know, what I find really interesting is a lot of corporations want to go much faster than nation states. And that's because they have project capability, they've got probably, you know, mostly, you know, reasonable balance sheets. But most importantly, I think it's become an important thing in the leadership. So it's become a personal ambition of leaders in many corporations to drive the change. And I think a lot of corporations are actually quite frustrated by the lack of ambition and creativity in the nation states. And so they're just sort of getting on with things, sometimes quietly, sometimes noisily. I'll give you a very nice example. So we have a partnership with Sainsbury's to decarbonize their estate and make it smart. And we worked with them on a what we call smart grid ready low carbon supermarket. It's in Hythe in Kent, and there's quite a few news articles about it. You can look it up. And so we sort of redesigned a lot of the systems in this supermarket. We made it very intelligent. It has on-site low-carbon generation. It has smart lighting, smart heating, and various other things. And it certainly performs much, much better. And it became a good learning exercise in their estate. So that was the sort of be-all and end-all of the project as far as we thought. And it was, we then took the learnings and rolled them out across the estate. But what was really interesting that came on afterwards is some big property fund a couple of years later came up to Sainsbury's and said, we have a lot of investments in our fund, and it's meant to invest in green buildings, and we actually haven't found many green buildings to put into our portfolio. So could we do a very, very financially favorable deal with you on a sale and lease back? So we'll buy the supermarket, and you can lease it back, but on very favorable terms, because we are very short of really proper high-quality green buildings. So that came up as a very big win for them, which was totally unintended. But it's an example of if you're brave and you get on with it. First of all, what we found was by being smart and focusing on decarbonisation, we actually saved a lot in terms of energy and water and many other things. So as we roll these things through the state, it actually saves them money. But this was a nice example of a win that wasn't even intended.
And also illustrating what you said earlier, that an early capex then...
Yeah. And smart choices, right? A lot of the things we thought about, actually, in the context of building a new supermarket, they're completely trivial. They would be in the noise. But it's about thinking holistically and doing it in time so that you embed these things and you make it a priority. I mean, I think that's the thing about the leadership of lots and lots of corporations, that they're making this a priority, so that becomes part of the operational practice and part of the thinking whenever you're doing new investments.
Yeah, so very important for decision makers and leaders to take the right choices. Just one last question for you, Francis. So you mentioned how your supply chain up and down might drive and use what you're doing. So how much of those links with your supply chain come from these leadership and decision makers, and how much are sort of driven by the financial questions?
Good question. I'd love to jump into their heads and find out. I guess I wouldn't have first-hand knowledge if, say, our leaders were engaging with the leaders of the other companies. I'm sure they are. I'm not invited to the meetings, so. But I'm sure there's a lot of work going on there, because I guess it is quite I won't say a small industry, but I think everyone sort of knows each other, and there's some major big players, and they all talk to each other. I think they all know each other quite well. Most of the work that we're doing is sort of on my level, if you like, on the ground level. The supply chain team, working with the account managers directly and working with them to explain to them what we want from them, what we need from them. Here are our targets. Here's how you can help us achieve them. Here's what's in it for you, potentially. It's a lot of work on that side of it. I think because, in the end, it doesn't necessarily have to cost money to go green or decarbonise. So that's not really the questions we get back about cost so much. I think a lot of it can be cost saving for people. It's just things they never thought about, really. That's one of the biggest things internally within the company and through the supply chain. So when we start talking about these things, it's not that it's really difficult to do or they've got a real problem or it's going to be really costly. They've just never thought about it before. So we put things into eco-design of our products, and we put those things in at the first stage. And the R&D teams, the design teams, it's not that they don't want to do it, it's just they never thought about it before. They didn't realise that affected emissions downstream, or this means we have to buy materials from that place rather than this place. They're just dots that they've never connected before. So there's not so much resistance as lack of awareness, I think. So there's not so many barriers we've got to cross over in that sense, of financial leadership or whatever. It's more about building the awareness. I think there's plenty of things people can do without there being any cost or implication to them at all. It's just getting in early and thinking about it early enough.
Oh, very interesting. And Agnieszka, do you feel that in your interactions with regulators, how important is this interaction with bringing to the light some of these co-benefits or easy wins versus, you know, the regulation and the more top-down approach?
Absolutely, and yeah, we are exchanging with them regularly, and we call for something that was already mentioned, for legal certainty, so that we can explain to our shareholders, because we all have shareholders, that this is a long-term investment that will pay off. And we are also working with the institutions on how to bring down the green premium, because all the companies that are active on green are still paying high invoice for that, because there is no supply, and still only certain part of society can afford this product. So we really have to work on economics here. And as I said, the market creation. So this is happening through public procurement. And then fourth is, of course, we just have to realize that we have not much choice. We are in Europe. We are warming in crazy speed time. We see all kind of events happening, floods, storms, everything. So our infrastructure, we are a critical infrastructure provider. Our infrastructure simply needs to be resilient. So this is in our business interest, and that I think is non-negotiable.
Thank you very much. I think I'll now open the floor to questions. Online or in the room, we have microphones very kindly being, yeah, let's start here, please. Maybe can you, when you ask a question, introduce yourself? And if the question is for someone in particular or for the whole panel, that would be helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, and thank you to all of the panel for all of your very, very useful and very insightful commentary. My name is Patricia Hutchinson. I've recently left the Anthropocene Fixed Income Institute, which aims to support investors in integrating climate change into investment decisions. A lot of my work there was based around deforestation, and in the past days we found that the rates of tropical deforestation where forest cover is over a 30% canopy density have increased astronomically in 2024 relative to the previous sort of 7 years where this was steadily decreasing. We've also seen the EUDR and the EU deforestation legislation, which seeks to prevent deforestation in the supply chain being delayed and watered down. My question is really for Professor Shah, but also I think potentially for Francis. Do you have examples of successful, cost-effective deforestation risk management or prevention in the supply chain that you could bring to the conversation?
I could start. Funnily enough, it's an example from a long time ago, and it was established by Kingfisher. So Kingfisher hired a chief sustainability officer in the 90s, someone by the name of Alan Knight. And, you know, he had engaged with a lot of NGOs to sort of understand what were some of the sustainability risks in Kingfisher's supply chain, so that's B&Q primarily. And they then were one of the first companies to start really thinking about what's happening upstream, where is this coming from, and how can we certify it? And in a way, it's strange, isn't it? You'd have thought something that started in the 90s would gain momentum and would be propagated across the sector, but in fact, it didn't, you know, lead to the outcomes expected. But I think that was it's a really good example where, again, it was someone with a personal desire to see big change in their company. And I think that was because he had evidence from NGOs. And I think, again, really sometimes clarifying the message just in the way you did with the quite specific statistics, and perhaps even extrapolating that a bit to where do you think most of that where the responsibility for that, which supply chains are accounting for that, whether that's palm oil, whether it's timber or whatever, and some idea of where that ends up. I think will wake people up. And as I say, I think there are specific individuals in big corporations that are responsible for sustainability, for sourcing, for strategic decisions that may not be fully aware and can quite quickly pivot. So certainly that Kingfisher 1990s example is a really good one. And we'd want to see much more accountability and responsibility. And if it comes to it, naming and shaming may have to take place as well. But you want to encourage people to take the right action.
I mean, no specific examples, but we do have an impact in the, well, we buy pulp or paper, we create paper for our transformers that are wrapped in it to insulate them, and we also use biofuels in our operations. Biofuels are sort of on the rise. It's small at the moment. It'll most likely rise as we decarbonise, especially the difficult to decarbonise areas that can't be electrified because they're too costly. So with those areas, we're at the moment building up our sort of capability to make sure we're buying things the right way. And we're relying mostly on standards and external third parties. So things like the CDP, Technical Note on Biofuels, and following all the standards that are listed in there and making sure that our suppliers are certified to at least one of those. Or following things like ISO 14067 and the standards that say what should be on a life cycle assessment or an environmental product declaration, to make sure that everything that we're buying is sort of transparent in where it's come from and what it does and how it's made and how it's produced. So that's capability that we're building. We're by no means perfect. We know where we want to get to. Obviously, there's supply chain sort of barriers there as well. Maybe there's only certain suppliers in the world, or there's only so many that exist, and we can't have everything all at once. It can't be perfect straight away. But we're applying the pressure, if you like, and putting those standards and guidance in place to make sure we're doing the right things as much as we can wherever we can.
Yuri, do you want to add a word on how, this is I think forests and biodiversity are a good example of how looking at things in silos can, pull out what are the trade-offs we're making. So I was wondering, in the pathways we saw earlier in the report, how this land use and the tool of forests to decarbonize can be done at the expense of other things or more efficient ways?
Yeah, I can comment on this shortly. I mean, forests, there is a variety of forests, and forests, we don't plant them only for their carbon content. And there is a clear risk that when we are considering nature-based solutions, of which forests actually are the dominant one that we are looking at, and we only look purely through a very narrow carbon lens, that this will, in the long term, even result in perverse incentives. In the short term, we'll plant lots of forests that are not necessarily the most resilient or the most biodiverse, but just grow really quickly in the short term. At the same time, this might also result in some ecosystems that we want to protect, but that are really vulnerable to climate change, that start actually reversing their carbon stocks, for them to be totally unprotected, because nobody is interested or there's no ways or there's no avenues or measures through which we can protect them durably in a changing world. So I think this is one of those areas where a single focused lens can do at times, more worse than good.
Agnieszka, how difficult is it to bring those dimensions into policy and policy conversations?
It really is difficult, but I would also just say that we should not focus on one piece of legislation per product. Like you mentioned EUDR, which is indeed very, very, very popular nowadays in terms of changes that happened. But I would think that there is this whole concept of digital product passport that was launched in ESPR, so the Eco-Design Products Regulation, which is quite limited for the moment. It applies to certain products, but I think an overall ambition is to literally have a world where you have digital product passport for every product, and this will be a great tool to bring transparency to these topics. So no product by product regulation, but such a tool that is very horizontal and will give all the data, and all the interested parties just grab what they need for their functioning. But again, this is a very idealistic vision. There are these ambitions, but yeah, it might take time. I just say let's look bigger than that.
Thank you. Our next question.
No, I'm happy to let someone who hasn't asked a question ask. Okay.
There's a question online.
Hello. Yeah, there's also a question online that I'm going to also complement a bit with one of my questions. So I think the trajectory that we're going, it's pretty clear that we've maybe also surpassed the 1.5 temperature goal. So it is also clear to me that we need to start thinking about adaptation. So to all the panel, how can we start doing that? And to the question on the chat, how will this improve the lives of the majority of people, or how could it improve the lives of the majority of people?
Thank you, Paula. Yuri, do you want to start?
Yeah. On the question for 1.5 and adaptation, yeah, it's clear. Currently, last year, global temperature, the average global temperature was 1.6. The underlying trend on which kind of interannual changes are superimposed is that somewhere between 1.3, 1.4. We're very close to 1.5. Our current emissions are still not globally not declining. So there is a very high chance that we will exceed 1.5. This has clear implications for adaptation, but in a way, I would say this is not new information for the adaptation community. Our current policy projections, so the projections of where warming or where current policies lead us in terms of warming, bring us to easy 3 degrees with some likelihood above 4 degrees by the end of the century. These are the levels of warming that the adaptation community, and maybe I shouldn't say adaptation community, any decision maker who puts in place infrastructure that needs to survive more than half a century should take into account that at this point, our trends are towards well above 2 degrees. So the fact that we are now at 1.5, even in the past decade, risk management shouldn't be looking at the most optimistic ambition that we are trying to pursue, but rather hedge against the risks that we can't exclude. And there, at this stage, even if we would be following a 1.5 degree pathway, there is like a 1 in 10 risk that we end up with 2.5 degrees of warming because of the uncertainty around the climate response. So this adaptation need and this resilient need is there. It becomes stronger with increasing warming, but there is no kind of sudden new epiphany of adaptation needs. They were there for the last decade, and there has been very little progress on addressing them.
Francis, investing in infrastructure must ring a bell for Hitachi Energy. How do you feel that these concerns are growing, or have they been well embedded early on?
They are growing. I think there's a general awareness. I think within our product design, it's always been considered. I know we've got people in the R&D teams who do work on that kind of thing and make sure that the products that we put in place are built for the environment that they're going into and the environment that might exist in 20, 30, 40, 50 years' time. So there is consideration already taking place there. It's being made more robust all the time, to be honest, with all our data and things, but the fact of it being considered has always been there. Same for our sites. We're building that capability now with understanding the risks to our sites around the world and all the different regions and all the impacts that may come their way, depending on where they are, lowland, highland, whatever it may be. And even though we're doing that work at sort of a company level, there's already lots of work going on at the local level anyway. Lots of people doing good work in preparing for floods and whatever it may be in their region, because they're more aware of it than we are. I sit in an office in the middle of Leicester, if it's me. I don't know, as well as someone in China, what's going to happen in the Beijing factory. So they're already, I think, well aware of the impacts they're facing. I think it's work being done there. I would say, it's becoming more robust. We're building capability, but the awareness is there. I would say that on the 1.5 degree thing, I think it's a little buzz for me. Sort of, it's a tick for me because it comes up and say, oh, it's going over 1.5, and I have to say no, it's an average over 10, 20, 30 years, whatever. So we haven't gone on 1.5 yet. Oh, but we'll do, won't we? So what? We don't stop because it just keeps getting worse. It's not like we miss it and we go, oh, well, never mind, on to the next target, whatever that may be in a different part of the economy. It will just keep going and keep getting worse and worse and worse. So just because we don't hit a 1.5 degree target does not mean we stop, because the impacts will just exponentially grow. And it becomes even more important to work even harder to mitigate it.
And I would just add that there is also a legislative work ongoing on the adaptation, but it is less political, and Brussels wants to keep it less political so that we do not end up in a situation where mitigation is forgotten and people just take adaptation saying, okay, we're gonna adapt to 1.25, then 2%, and life goes on. So these two layers should be seen at different level of political attention for a reason. And then, so Brussels is preparing its adaptation strategy, should be out also sometime this year. And as I said, in the review of the public procurement directive, there will be non-price criteria, but also resilience criteria. And that's how adaptation is called in Brussels often, resilience criteria.
The question... No, Simon had his up. There was a hand early on in that area. I'm not sure which hand it was.
So my name is Tom Richards. I currently work for UK Power Networks. My job is working on our distribution future energy scenarios and basically planning ahead of where we're going to invest in which substations to make sure there's capacity in the grid. In our last DFES that was published a couple of months ago, we brought in for data centers, only what's in the connections queue, which amounted to, I think, about 4,000 megawatts. That's obviously a massive amount of demand just on a few point loads and specific substations. I'm curious how, and currently in the team we're working on, how are we going to actually have our future scenarios take into account data centers, because they'll significantly change the pathways. I'm just quite curious to understand your thoughts on how you're incorporating data centers into your scenario analysis, and by extension, how that impacts the pathways that we've been working towards, because I see them having a big change, especially as what Professor Nile said, that if a new data center needs to be net zero, that will significantly change how much generation we actually need to achieve this.
Yeah, maybe I can start. So,
I mean, I think the whole Rio framework that we have, if we take the UK context, that needs to change, right? So there are exercises going on in the UK that you're probably familiar with, like the SSEP and the LEAP, where we're trying to do more strategic planning around energy infrastructure. And I think the incremental approach and observe demand and invest, that has to go away. And in fact, some combination of strategic spatial planning and a notion of a master plan of where does it make sense to signpost to people who want to invest in data centers that these are the places to put it, whether that's through regional energy pricing or permitting or signposting. I think we have to move away from this kind of bottom-up approach where it's very weird that somebody can put 100 megawatts of demand on the system without the same queuing procedure as someone putting 100 megawatts of supply who may have to wait 7 years. So I think the whole system around planning infrastructure has to change. It has to become more thoughtful, more strategic, more oriented towards master planning, and probably more towards indicating where, or at least partnering. And a good example of where this worked well, let me start with an example where it worked really badly. Victorian Railways, right? Driven completely bottom-up, private investors, developing their own systems, sometimes on different technology, different routes, not thinking about interconnections, nationalized, I think, in the 50s or 60s, and completely rationalized and taken into public ownership. Where it worked really well was when the North Sea was beginning to be developed in the late 60s, where it was mainly to be developed by the private sector and licenses given, but the idea was not to have a spaghetti junction of pipes bringing crude oil and natural gas, but a shared master planning between Board of Trade, as it was then, and the operators to develop a time-evolved master plan of how the North Sea would develop. And I think that kind of approach where government, NISO in the UK would convene and then the participants would engage is the kind of thing I think we'd need. And then, of course, for DNOs like yourself to be part of that debate, because you know where capacity is available, you know where the congestion is, you know where it's going to be expensive or cheap to invest with. So that's the kind of system we need, and then that can flow through into whatever comes after Rio. And I think in the UK, we probably have a very good way of doing these things, so we can become one of the exemplar countries for how you plan national and local infrastructure.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question. Dai.
Hi, I'm Di Richards from Hitachi Energy, Government Affairs in the UK. First of all, thanks to all of the team who pulled the report together and the panel for very, very interesting discussion. We've touched on this a little bit, but I think all of us in this room and probably lots of the audiences that we talk to are all understand a lot of the things that we've talked about, see the need, the urgent need for tackling climate change, etc. But in order to make sure that the climate skeptics or the more or less informed general population sort of take part in domestic flexibility, for example, which is going to be crucial, but also provide the political background that will allow some brave / unpopular decisions to be made around policy. How do we get the narrative told to those folks to get them on board? And accompanying that, who is in the best position to tell that narrative or start sharing that narrative?
Thank you. An easy question to finish. Agnieszka, what?
I'm happy to kick off. We have to do a thorough study to understand people's concerns and avoid this strategy of one size fits all. An example, so we are mainly B2B companies, so we talk with governments, we sell it to utility companies, we sell it to governments, and what these guys are struggling now with is short budgets and all sort of criteria. Your product needs to be resilient, secure, and so on and so forth. So how do we respond to that? We have to vulgarize in the sense that we will tell them, okay, you're gonna pay green premium for our product because it is done with resource energy and resource savvy materials, but it's gonna last longer. And it is resilient to this, and that. And this is the mathematics. And instead of buying this product twice and cheaper, you're going to buy it only once, and it will last longer. So you are winning, and you are ticking all the boxes. But again, the most challenging is to understand the priorities of these people and to take the time, because we are living in this crazy speed times, where you just have to make a lot of noise, but I really think we need to take the time to understand our audience and adjust to their needs. Same with B2C. It's better for people to understand that if they buy one washing machine, this is a better calculation for them than 5 washing machines that are not done to last. You see, so it is defendable, but we need to be smarter in defending climate. Really, I think.
Yuri, how difficult is it to convey the sense of urgency to, deniers or skeptics or?
I think there is a clear difference between deniers skeptics. They're kind of in the same group. Skepticism, scientific skepticism, is of course good, but unfortunately they have kind of misappropriated the label there. I think any conversation that you are trying to have with somebody who is with an unfaithful counterpart, or who can't be swayed by evidence or by any arguments except for political alignment, is a hard one to have, and it is really hard to again try to change this from the narrative first, and then hope that there is actions. I think I agree, we can do studies. I think we also, to a very large degree, understand some of the key challenges that people struggle with. The cost of living crisis is one of them. If we can put in place examples of how certain choices and certain actions have led to better quality of life, lower cost of living, more reliable services, I think that is the way forward. I mean, I'm privileged. I can have an electric car. I want my car to be plugged in all the time, and I want Octopus to decide when it's charged, because I pay 7p per kilowatt hour, and otherwise I will pay 30p per kilowatt hour. Obvious. I mean, I don't think, I mean, actually I might think, but typically I wouldn't do it because I want to really help the grid being able to balance and everything. No, I want that 7p a kilowatt hour. And that's the kind of examples and that's the kind of incentives at all levels that need to be given. It needs to be easy and obvious.
Francis, in your interactions with...
I just agree with what Yuri's saying. It's pretty much, I've managed to convince most of my friends and family to all get electric cars now. Regardless of the capex of it, it's the opex that's the attractive part, the reduced bills, and yeah, most of them have switched over, but it's just me influencing my immediate circle. It needs to be bigger than that and wider than that. Somehow get those messages to a wider audience at a larger scale. So little things like you go into the supermarket and I'll say to my wife, you know, chocolate's going up in price. And I'll say, I bet you will go up again in 2 or 3 weeks' time because there's a crop in Nigeria that just failed. And lo and behold, it does. And I sort of see it and I think, yes, because I was right. But it's not a good thing. I think people don't make those links. They'll see the cost of living crisis and think that's the biggest problem. And they don't make the link that it's actually connected to climate and decarbonisation or sustainability in general. And those links aren't there, so people aren't sort of prioritising it in their minds. And there's other things that are taking the fore. I think, yeah, I don't think the problem is so much with climate deniers or people who are against it. I think it's just back of their mind at the moment because there's other more important things that are taking their attention and they're not making the links that actually climate, sustainability are still part of those things that are at the forefront of your mind. You just don't know it, aren't aware of it, aren't aware of the connections or connecting the dots. Who connects those dots and how you get people to understand that, I don't know. It's a good question. The government in some way, some sort of education program. I know children coming through schools these days don't need to be told it. It's automatic in their brains. So it's mostly people of my age and older that need to be told it. So I don't know how you get through to the middle-aged and old fogies of the country, but yeah, I'd be interested to find out.
Nile, any final thoughts?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think one challenge we've had is we don't think about do the easy things first and leave the difficult things. So, you know, in Germany, they had this thing of mandating switching heating systems too soon for the general public, right? So if you take the UK and you think about heating and transport, which are the two things that probably people will need to make choices about, that's 30 million households, start by legislating quite strongly on the non-domestic sector, yeah, on the institutional sector and the commercial sector. So say, you know, you really have to follow this trajectory on your heating systems and your transport systems. So that's the NHS, the MOD, all government to state. It comes to your point about procurement, and then cascading into local authorities, schools, universities, right? Moving then into the socially provided housing sector. What that does is it does a number of things, right? It builds scale. It puts the choices in relatively few decision makers, and you can provide public support for that procurement. You can have novel financing schemes, but you build a supply chain. You build familiarity, right? People start to go and see these things at the doctor's surgery, at the dentist, in the hospital, in the school. It cascades. And then, you know, you can let it go into the harder to reach things where the cost has come down, experience is developed, infrastructure is in place. You know, we talk about the electricity distribution system, that it has scaled up, the charging points are there. So think about it from a systems point of view and do the easiest bit first and the bit which has few decision makers but with big impact. And then that really simplifies, it demystifies, it will get rid of a lot of the disinformation because people will see, oh, these things work, they're easy, they're convenient, they're cheap, they don't create NOx emissions and so on. So again, being smart about the choices, but actually being brave at the same time, I think is critical.
Thank you very much. It's a great word to finish with. Be brave. So before I think, well, let's first thank the panel for these really interesting insights. Thank you to the co-authors of the report that led to this great publication and also to this very interesting morning. Thank you to everyone for coming. And last but not least, I want to thank Anka, who's helped us make a success of today, and to all the other helpers in the room who've been supporting us in not only the last few weeks, but also the last few years. So thank you. And our Hitachi colleagues and Imperial, we invite you for a cup of tea. It's too early for drinks, so let's have tea and coffee to continue with a productive day. Thank you very much.